Number 3. Persecution of followers. Satan could target and persecute individuals who witnessed or were a part of the millennial reign, silencing their testimonies and preventing the spread of information about Christ's reign. Well, isn't that interesting? See, that's a part of the theory we have around this, involving the orphan trains and the insane asylums, assuming the little season began, sometime after the Enlightenment period into the middle 1700s, early 1800s, and then onwards. And people have been speculating that this mass influx of just orphans all over Europe and America, which seems to just come out of nowhere, and the sudden incarceration of hundreds of thousands of people into insane asylums around the same period. We're speculating that was this basically the locking up of those who were witnessed to the millennial kingdom and refused to shut up about it, dubbing them as insane religious fanatic lunatics, and their children were then separated from their parents, who were now locked away in insane asylums, and spread out all over the place as some kind of cheap labor force to dig out buildings and I don't know, sweep chimneys and like fill up the factories. Like, why would it was just children working in factories everywhere while fat cats in top hats were walking around cities and gallivanting around having fun, And it's kind of, what an odd world that was. What an odd scenario and way of being for a civilization to be. And maybe this millennial reign answers that question, especially with the persecution of followers. It's kind of immediately, as soon as the little season began, they were persecuted and locked up into insane asylums and possibly even lobotomized to shut them up. And their children, who maybe don't remember the world their parents grew up in, were re-educated. Isn't that an interesting thought? And we do seem to have some kind of evidence that something similar to that really did happen. So we have to wonder. So number 4, creation of counterfeit evidence. Satan might create counterfeit evidence or artifacts to deceive people into believing a false version of events during the millennial reign. And this is basically just a reinterpretation of things that have been dug up, And I find it interesting, and this might not be exactly linked to the millennial reign, but it's things like, we suddenly discovered paleontology in the last 200 years, 150 years. And we're digging up these bones of giant femurs and these giant bones of monsters and big lizards. And it's kind of, we've come up with this whole science and narrative now called paleontology, which has come up with a multi-million year timeline, to explain away where these big lizards came from. Which, by the way, now they're not even calling them big lizards anymore, but big feathered serpent chicken monsters instead, something else. So the narrative is still changing even to this day. But is that not, in a way, a cover-up or a creation of counterfeit evidence to justify a false narrative of evolution, when really it's possible these things didn't really live that long ago and are perhaps the result of some kind of genetic corruption that took place instead, i.e. through the creation of the Nephilim and the hybridization of animals and the mixing of kinds that happened just before the flood of Noah. So it's kind of, we see that they do create false counter evidence. They find the remains of what we used to call dragons, which are roaming around during the medieval period, and we call them dinosaurs instead, that were millions of years ago, so it's kind of finding evidence and counterfeiting it or coming up with a false narrative to explain it away. It's no doubt that they have done this to all of our history. Uncovering the Roman bathhouses, these ruins underground. And it's kind of like, okay, fair enough. So you found this old Roman architecture, which was only used thousands of years ago, recently during the millennial reign, and it suddenly, for some reason, got buried under 20 feet of mud. How the hell did that happen? People weren't burying stuff like that, Something suddenly happened to make it suddenly be buried. And we know that the mud flood is a huge part of this theory. There was a sudden destructive event, possibly at the release of Satan for the little season, which caused a lot of things to get buried suddenly and quickly, and liquefaction is a real phenomena in which when you apply intense vibration to solid ground, mud, matter, it turns into liquid and things sink. So it's possible that's what happened. And again, if this is the idea of they are counterfeiting evidence to and coming up with false narratives to fit these archaeological discoveries into to explain them away, when it's possible this Little Season narrative and the Millennial Kingdom narrative is a better explanation for why these things even exist and why they are where they are. So number 5 is the manipulation of memories. In a more supernatural scenario, Satan could potentially manipulate people's memories or perceptions to make them forget or doubt the reality of the millennial reign of Christ. And this is where things get really interesting, because this is hinting at something like the Mandela effect. The idea that in a spiritual sense, people's memories of how things used to be are going to be altered. And I did a video with John Kerwin recently covering the Mandela effect, because it is a topic I haven't really covered since like 2017 when it first became a phenomena. But the premise is that things quite literally are changing compared to what people remember them being. One major example is the Fruit of the Loom logo doesn't have a loom and never did, which is odd, right? Things like that. Or another common one is the James Bond movie that has the Jaws guy with the metal teeth. The woman, his love interest, doesn't have braces and never did, which suddenly makes the movie not make any sense anymore. Because the whole point he would be attracted to this woman is that she did have metal in her teeth, just like him. You know what I mean? So it's odd things like this, which are seemingly trivial, are changing. But then also it seems like the Bible is also changing, which is a huge, huge thing when you really think about it. And again, go listen to the talk I did with John Kerwin about this, and he lays out all the biblical changes that seem to be taking place and his take on it all. But the fact that this AI would say manipulate people's memories in a spiritual sense is chilling, when we know that does seem to quite literally be happening in the Mandela effect style. So she goes on to ask, well, what else would you do? And then it gives more points. It says, in addition to the previously mentioned tactics, if I were to further speculate on what Satan might do to erase all evidence of the millennial reign of Christ, here are some additional hypothetical strategies he might employ. Number 1, creation of false religions. Satan could establish or promote false religions or belief systems that contradict or overshadow the true narrative of the millennial reign of Christ, leading people away from the truth. And isn't it interesting, that we do have plenty of religions around today in complete contradiction to Christ? And is it possible these religions aren't as old as we've been told in many cases, and they're actually quite new creations? And also, never mind the religious sects that have kind of splintered off from Christianity, which muddy the waters on Christianity itself and what the truth even is. There's like over 40,000 denominations today of Christendom. Isn't that exactly what the devil would do to the one true Church of Christ if something like that did exist during the millennial reign? Likely. And I know the Catholics claim to be the continuation of that one true Church of Christ when they examine the millennial kingdom theory. But if the Catholic Church today is that thing, then it has to be incredibly far removed from what it originally was. And the amount of corruption that's taken over that church since the little season began is unprecedented. But even then, that is likely what Satan would do as well. Utterly corrupt the church that did exist during that time. So it says here, number 2, manipulation of technology. Satan might exploit advanced technology to manipulate digital records, create deep fake videos, or use other deceptive means to fabricate evidence or distort historical accounts related to the millennial reign. So this is very much a today problem. And with the rise of AI as it is, it's actually incredibly easy to fabricate false imagery now. So that it's getting harder and harder to discern what is and isn't historically accurate because of this. And that is exactly what would happen during a little season to keep us confused. And we're seeing it happen right now already. Number 3, control of educational institutions. By influencing educational institutions and curricula, Satan could shape the way history is taught and understood, ensuring that any references to the millennial reign of Christ are omitted or portrayed inaccurately. And then we know, don't we, we're taught about the Dark Ages today, which was like 1,000-year period of Christian control, and they they kind of paint it as like this time where nothing much really happened worth documenting. It was a slow progression of humanity. It kind of came to a standstill. Nothing changed in 1,000 years. Nothing developed because Christianity was just so terrible and backwards. People were killing each other and believing in fantasies and brutal things because of the Christian way of viewing things. And there may have been the odd skirmish here and there and feudal battles between kingdoms, but nothing like major of note. Everything moved pretty slow. It was a dark time for humanity, full of death and pestilence and misery. It was a dull, drab, grey era where colour didn't exist. They kind of paint it as this horrible time to be alive, which we've boxed off as the Dark Ages, and we came out of it with the Age of Enlightenment, and then there was a Renaissance boom of technology and creativity towards coming out the 1600s into the 1700s, where humans just advanced, and everything was perfect. And let's just talk about that time up until now, and let's just forget about that boring old Dark Ages. And that is number 3, control the educational institutions. Make sure any reference to the millennial reign of Christ are omitted or portrayed inaccurately. And isn't it odd that we have a 1,000-year period in our supposed history, which we don't really talk about, where Christendom ruled supreme? It kind of fits, doesn't it, to what they're saying here? And we have to think about that. I just think that's the fact that this AI phrased it like this is very interesting. So at number 4, Satan could enforce strict censorship and suppression of any information or individuals associated with the millennial reign, effectively silencing dissident voices and preventing the truth from being known. And, so far, I haven't seen much censorship on me talking about this topic. So maybe that does lay more credence to that. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe they don't need to cover this up because it's not actually something that needs covering up. Or maybe it's too early to tell, because it's only really been in the past 3 to 4 years have people started to really question this in an open public manner more than ever before. There's always been formalized Christian worldviews such as preterism, which kind of believes that a lot of prophecy was fulfilled in 70 AD, but never really anyone discussing it in a modern context like today, or phrasing it in a sense of the little season hasn't been that long and our history is a complete lie. This is the first time we've really been talking about it from a conspiratorial perspective, coming out of the Tartarian research of like 2016 to 2019. So this is quite new. Perhaps too early to see any real censorship attempts on this, or perhaps to censor this would give it too much credence. And because this is the big one, like the big secret, they can't be seen to take it seriously. And if they censored it, that would be a hint that they're taking it seriously and they can't afford that. So maybe they're just going to let people like me run rampant and talk about this forever, and never even mentioning it or bringing it up, or even acknowledging that we exist as people who think about this, because that would then give the everyday people too much interest in the topic and it could blow everything up wide open. I'm just speculating here. Either it's too early for the censorship to begin and we might see it soon, or it's too risky to censor because it might give people too much credence to go and check it out. So that's my working theory on that one. But we certainly saw censorship and suppression in the early stages of the release of Satan, where he locked up all the people in insane asylums and moved all the children around and re-educated them in the schools. So that did happen in the early days. Perhaps not today, because people have been living in futurism for so long. It's early days yet, and the verdict's still out on whether or not we're going to be censored for talking about this. So number 5, promotion of secularism and materialism. By promoting secularism, materialism, and focusing on worldly pursuits, Satan could distract people from spiritual truths and diminish the significance of events like the millennial reign of Christ to the collective consciousness. Now, isn't that interesting? We're living in that time, are we not? Where secularism and materialism reign supreme. People are obsessed with self and stuff. And the whole world is geared around earning money to buy more stuff and to make the self feel better. Okay? People are so distracted by work that they don't have time to think about things bigger than anything from their immediate world or surroundings. Everyone's so hyper-focused on their own life, they don't have time to think about the bigger questions of timelines and spiritual matters. Everyone's obsessed with materialism. And we know that's the world we live in. Well, there's plenty of memes and jokes and videos out there and artwork out there expressing this fact that we're living in a hyper-materialistic, sad existence, where people are depressed and lonely and isolated from one another, focusing too much on selfish, trivial vanity. We know that. And I shouldn't have to prove that that's the case, but could it be that this is because they're trying to make people not focus on the right things and not realize the time they're actually living in, the little season? So there's the final thing that ChatGPT offered Maureen when she asked. And like I said, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's likely that these algorithms have pulled from the many websites, blog posts, and video posts from people like myself who have discussed these angles already and the possibilities of how they've covered it up. And they're just summarizing our work back to the person asking the question. And that would remove any spiritual nefariousness from any of this, and it would be a logical explanation for where this information has come from. And I'm likely more leaning towards that's what's going on here. But this AI algorithm has certainly phrased it and summarized it very well in this post here. So I hope you guys got something interesting from this. Again, this one's a little bit of fun. Take it all with a pinch of salt. I still don't trust AI technology for what it is. I do think it's going to be used against us rather than for our benefit in the long run, that's for sure, however that may manifest. But if you ask AI to roleplay as Satan and ask it, how would you cover up the millennial reign? Its answers are chillingly realistic.